Growing up, I became a fan of comic books, specifically the Marvel and DC characters, and this came about through my love of the cartoon shows. I grew up watching the 1967 Spider-Man series along with the 1981 Spider-Man show and Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. And it was through these shows that I became familiar with a certain group of heroes, the X-Men, specifically the episode A Firestar is Born. Fast forward to the 1990s and X-Men the animated series was dominating the TV world with its brilliant action and fascinating storytelling. And I had just hit that age where it wasn't just about the colourful characters and the action, it was about very well written storylines and character arcs, because you can have all the good animation in the world, but what good is it if the stories are rubbish? Into my foray into the world of comic books, specifically the X-Men. The comics have been around since the 60s, so there's just tons and tons of stories to dive into, and quite frankly I just might need to clone myself if I'm ever going to get through each and every one. I would go to the comics as a continuation of watching the cartoon, and there were some direct comic adaptations of the animated series, but the main comic book universe was much wider and much more vast. I would pay about £1.20 or so for the Essential X-Men series a month, just to keep up with my collection. Now around the mid 2000s or so, this was at a time when the age of digitization was really taking a grip on pop culture. So now a lot of things were being done online, so whether it was shopping on Amazon or eBay or downloading video games, watching videos online with YouTube, etc. On eBay I was browsing through as you do, looking for comic books, and lo and behold I came across this fascinating gem called 40 Years of the Xmen DVD. 40 years worth of comic books all on one DVD. And at a price of around £25 to £30, an absolute bargain. All the comics from the 60s to the 90s, plus some special annuals, and I could read them all on my laptop. A great illustration of the miracles of modern technology. It was so wonderful being able to go back in time with all these classics, and one of the first stories that I binged was the Phoenix and Dark Phoenix sagas. The comics got it right. The cartoon got it right, so how have the movies managed to botch this story twice? Shame. Well, it was in the hands of Fox at the time. Now, with the X-Men under the guidance of Kevin Feige and the Marvel Universe, maybe we can get those X-Men and Fantastic Four stories MCU style. Now granted, it was not all the X-Men comics from these decades, but the main ones, the Uncanny X-Men stories. At times it was like reading a soap opera sci-fi series with a number of dramatic storylines mixed with the action. I have mentioned how the 90s X-Men animated series got me into comic books as well, and you can see from the 90s illustrations exactly where the cartoon drew its inspiration from. This has forever stuck with me personally, and whenever I think of the X-Men in the animated world, it's usually these designs that come to mind. A lot more so than in later animated incarnations of the X-Men. As mentioned earlier, I used to read a series called the Essential X-Men, and it was through this that I came across two very famous X-Men story arcs, the Age of Apocalypse and the Onslaught Saga. Now a number of these were found on the DVD series, but not all. The rest I had to purchase separately. The Age of Apocalypse saga saw the death of Charles Xavier by his son Legion, or David Haller, and it set off a chain of events. Apocalypse could foresee these turn of events, and when it all went down, the world of the X-Men had been drastically altered. Legion had travelled back in time to murder Magneto before he became the powerful mutant who would go on to wage war against humanity for mutant supremacy. By killing Magneto, Legion theorized that he would not go on to become the powerful enemy of Xavier. But plans changed when Xavier got in the way and he took the fatal blow. The entire universe changed as a result. Magneto, as a homage to his dead friend, became the leader of the X-Men. He was married to Rogue, and the rest of the team consisted of Sabretooth, Wildchild, Morph, Blink, and Sunfire. There were affiliated teams created in this particular universe. A second X-Men team had Storm, Dazzler, Iceman, Banshee, Exodus, and the team leader Quicksilver. Gambit led a team known as the Externals. A Generation Next team is formed, which is led by husband and wife Colossus and Shadowcat. Wolverine is known as Weapon X in this world, and he and Jean Grey are an item. Cyclops and his brother Havoc are the villains in the story, and they work for Apocalypse. Mr. Sinister is also part of this group, and unlike in the regular continuity, he has a bond with Cyclops, a sort of father-son type relationship. So it is a really crazy and wild storyline, a reimagining or what-if type scenario giving the established characters a brand new makeover. Now there is a lot to get through on this long and quite frankly convoluted story. The best thing would be to get these comics for yourselves. There are plenty of good sources to purchase these stories from, like Comics Zoology, etc. The Age of Apocalypse storyline is so vast that it spans several comics aside from the Uncanny X-Men that I had to purchase these separately, and to be brutally honest, after all these years it is still like a minefield to me. The second major story to be taken from the comic book series was the Onslaught Saga. Like the Age of Apocalypse story, it spanned over several comics and not just the X-Men show. The main premise of the story was the being known as Onslaught, who was the creation of the consciousness of both Professor X and Magneto. During a fight between the X-Men and Magneto with his acolytes, Magneto ripped out Wolverine's adamantium skeleton, which set off Xavier, and he vowed Magneto would do no more harm to anyone and permanently shut down his brain, leaving Magneto in a catatonic state. The psychic contact resulted in Magneto's anger and vengeance merging with Xavier's frustrated dark side, which created a separate being known as Onslaught. It lay dormant within Xavier, but slowly began to influence and take over. The threat of Onslaught was an event of epic proportions. He was so powerful that he mentally beat up Juggernaut, who ended up becoming scared of him. It also created a massive Marvel crossover event that had the X-Men team up with the Fantastic Four and the Avengers. It also involved the son of the Fantastic Four's Reed and Sue Richards, young Franklin, and the son of Jean Grey and Scott Summers' Nate Grey. Excuse me? I thought Cable was their son. Okay, little backstory here. Nate Grey is known as X-Man. He is an alternate version of the regular Marvel Universe mutant Cable. He came from the Age of Apocalypse reality Earth 295. He is the biological son of this dimension Scott Summers and Jean Grey, born of genetic tampering by Mr. Sinister. My god, this is way more complicated than your average soap opera. In my opinion, this was the comic book's version of the Avengers Infinity War and Endgame movies. Speaking of which, both were inspired by the 1991, 1992 and 1993 crossover events in the comic series. Just a massive gathering of Marvel's finest. Now, I have to confess, this story was so vast and convoluted to keep up with. Given the number of crossover individual comics involved, things were just all over the place for me in terms of which story was next and what was the involvement of other characters outside of the X-Men, as Onslaught was primarily an X-Men villain that expanded across the Marvel Universe. It all ended with the heroes triumphant, but seemingly at the cost of the Avengers and the Fantastic Four. As it turned out, they had survived and they were placed into a pocket universe created by Franklin Richards, and eventually all returned to their correct realities. Yes, I forgot to mention that the young boy Franklin possessed very powerful psionic and reality-shaping abilities that makes him more powerful than most Omega-level mutants. Because, you know, powerful beings everywhere in the Marvel. I did say it was long and convoluted to keep up with, didn't I? Now, I read mainly the X-Men issues in this saga, and the other parts like the Avengers, Fantastic Four, X-Force and Generation X, Spider-Man and the Hulk, these were all parts that I read years later. And I'm still confused. That said, if there is one comic book storyline that I would love to see adapted onto the big screen, it would be the Onslaught Saga. I find Onslaught a very fascinating character with a great origin story, and seeing him appear in the Marvel vs. Capcom 2 video game as the final boss was an excellent treat. But he was extremely difficult to beat though. Took me forever. Another thing I learned reading some of the comic books was that the X-Men were split into two different teams, the Blue Team and the Gold Team. The Blue Team, led by Cyclops, had Gambit, Rogue, Jubilee, Psylocke, Beast and Wolverine. The Gold Team was led by Storm and consisted of Jean Grey, Colossus, Archangel, Bishop, Forge, and Iceman. You can see from these two teams how the 90s cartoon show was influenced in terms of its roster. There is 4 decades worth of comic books in this DVD series, and I have not even begun to scratch the surface. I mean, there are your hardcore fans that live and breathe and sleep all things superhero comic books. I try, but let's face it, well, with life and other responsibilities, it's just simply not possible to read absolutely everything. However, there are those times where I can binge an entire story arc like the ones I've already mentioned. But then that is the beauty of this series. You can always dive in by decade or year and pick a set and read away on your laptop or PC at your own leisure. These special 40 years of collection DVDs were made by the Git Corporation, and I went on a little shopping spree collecting other Marvel titles like the 40 years of Spider-Man, Iron Man, Captain America, the Hulk, the Fantastic Four, and the Avengers. So altogether that's around 244 years of comic books in my collection. Oh yeah, I also have the Ultimate Xmen and the Ultimate Spider-Man series as well. How I'm going to get through all of these, I have absolutely no idea. Now if only I could speed read like the Flash. Sadly, the Git Corporation no longer produce these titles. I don't know if it's a licensing issue, but unfortunately these DVD collections have become very rare collector's items, which could still be found on places like eBay or at a comic convention, but for about 3 times the price than when they were still in production. I consider myself very lucky to have purchased these when I did. I used to think of comic books as a read-only version of the cartoon, but it is so much more than that. The storylines are way more mature, they're quite convoluted, and at times way more violent. So much so that the adaptations to the cartoons are toned down simply to comply with TV ratings, especially with younger audiences watching. I do wonder how they would have managed to pull off Magneto ripping out Wolverine's adamantium skeleton in the 90s animated series. I am a firm believer in quality over quantity, so if the stories are told right and are very interesting and compelling, then there's no need for over-the-top violence. If it's possible to find any of these collector's items anywhere for a reasonable price, I would highly recommend it. 40 years worth of comics all in one place. It would save space on your shelves, and for all those long journeys into work or flights abroad, it can keep you quite occupied and entertained. No, they won't quite have the same value as the actual paperback issues, especially those from the golden era of comics back in the 60s and 70s. That said, the pluses outweigh the negatives, so 40 years of the X-Men, a must-say for anyone who is a fan of the X-Men and Marvel Comics. And as Stan Lee himself would put it,
in other words, Excelsior!